Great. So, Steve, welcome to this little chat we're going to have. It's going to be good fun because it's one of my favourite topics to do with the Beatles, which is the Beatles and the films. So, first of all, just give us, because you've written this great book, um, give us a little overview of that, and then I want to get into some of the films, some of the questions, and what you've discovered. So, give us a little overview of Act Naturally.
Sure. First of all, it's great to be here. I was going to say, so the famous David Bedford, but I won't make that joke. Okay. So thanks for having me. This is really fun to be with you. This is a dream come true. So we've
I
met
mean, it was great that we
before.
got to meet as well, wasn't it, in February? That was
Yes,
fun.
yes, and we had met prior to that, but
Yeah.
you won't remember that, but I do.
You're a good man.
We met at one of the other a fest for Ruddle fans.
Yeah.
So yes, so this book, and I just happen to have a copy of it right here.
Wow. What are the chances of that?
What are the chances? Yeah, Act Naturally, the Beatles on film. It's almost exactly a year old. So it's been quite a year.
Yeah.
It's flown by, and basically this is my second book on the Beatles, and it's on the five films. That's really all we cover. I don't really get into any of the other sorts of things that went on while the Beatles were together, and
Yeah.
I don't get into any of the films after. I mean, obviously, I will reference films that are significant that the Beatles were involved in, like How I Won the War,
Yeah.
or Magic Christian, things like that.
Yeah.
That are significant to the story. I don't go into depth, but really, it's about the five films. And then, as you know, I do go into quite a bit about sort of the history of British film, the sort of pre A Hard Day's Night British history. And then throughout the book, I will talk about other significant 60s British films, the
Great.
Bond films, films that are significant to this very important period in British film.
Definitely.
It's a really important time when British film is really, it's almost the center of the film world for a period there. And you have directors that are not British based going there to make films at this time.
Yeah.
And so, that's what this is, a film book. I know a lot of people, oh, it's a Beatles book. Yes, it's a Beatles book. Oh, it's a music book. Yes, it's a music book, but it is a film book. So I think people who are interested in film and film history, particularly 60s films, particularly British films, I think they will get a lot out of this book.
Well, that's me. You basically have written the book for me. So
That's great.
I am very happy with that. So that's the overview. So let's we'll lead up to Hard Day's Night. So just give us that overview from what you were just saying of where British film was before we get to A Hard Day's Night.
I mean, there was always really great British films. I mean, there's no question that, you know, it is part of film history. I mean, we can talk about films like The Third Man. We can talk about directors, like, David Lean. I mean, there's so much we could talk about prior to A Hard Day's Night.
Yeah.
But Hollywood was always sort of the center of the film world. It's kind of always how it's been.
Yeah.
After World War II, you saw Italy and you saw France emerging as major meccas of filmmaking, important films being made. Sweden, to a lesser degree. Other places around the world, Japan, we could go on and on about this. But what happens is in the early 60s, Britain starts grappling with where they stand in the post-war world in a big way. And we start seeing different genres emerging, such as the kitchen sink films. We start seeing various directors and actors emerging, and not just for British audiences, but for international audiences. And this is mostly the case with actors. Michael Caine, Peter O'Toole, Julie Christie, Peter Sellers. These folks become major international stars. Yeah. Albert Finney. Yeah. The film Tom Jones, in many respects, is almost more than A Hard Day's Night, the film that sort of breaks everything wide open, because suddenly these films are not just critically acclaimed, but they are drawing huge box office around the world and definitely in America. There's no question about this. So A Hard Day's Night kind of happens, right around the time of Tom Jones and the Bond films. And so this becomes the center of the sort of film world briefly. And culturally, obviously, with the Beatles, the British invasion, but also, prior to all of this, we had this explosion going on culturally in England, in London in particular, with fashion, photography, art, the clubs, the theater, television. It's all happening. It's the place, swinging London. Yeah. So, that this all fascinates me. See, for you, this is your home country. Yeah. This is your history. But it's almost, for me, it's almost more interesting and more fascinating, because it's like, it's so exciting,
Well, I do the same with the music, because, of course, the music that was inspiring the Beatles was American. So I have a fascination with American music and American culture. Now I'm looking at skiffle and at country and then rock and roll. So I totally get where you're coming from, because I love learning about this other culture that was so important. And whether we're talking about, the comics that were over here, the cowboy films, the television series, the radio series, American culture was, particularly in Liverpool, but in the UK, those American influences were heavily there. So just as you're talking about British, I love learning about the American culture. So it's this wonderful exchange that we can do. And isn't it fun when you start learning this and you just get addicted to it?
Yeah. It's very much hands across the water,
Yeah. Yeah.
And it goes back and forth where, the British music is more influential, then it's the American music is more influential. It keeps kind of going back and forth all the way through to the punk new wave thing. It starts in the early 60s. Well, it starts with the American music in the 50s, and then it goes to England. It goes back and forth, and it's interesting and exciting. And then there's times when they're both sort of almost equal, and they're equally feeding off each other. And these sort of centers of culture kind of move around. In America, it wasn't necessarily a particular place. Maybe you could say it was the South where rock and roll started. You could say that, but then it becomes like the Greenwich Village scene, the folk scene in Greenwich Village. Then it's the British invasion. Then it's, then that becomes more London based. Then it goes back to America, to LA. With all of that, the Mamas and the Papas, and the Byrds, and then it kind of goes back to England again, and then maybe it goes to San Francisco. You know what I mean? It just goes on and on. It's so interesting,
which is great. That's the best thing about it, because you can't just stick it. There's one genre and one country. It's almost like that. The good rivalry within the Beatles between John and Paul, which spurred them on to greatness, because there was another challenge, and each one takes them up another level. And that's what I think our two countries were doing.
Yes.
So the Beatles are bringing out, then of course the Beach Boys bring out Pet Sounds, and Beatles go, hang on a sec, we've got to beat that. And that's what makes everything better and better again, because you've got that competition, and it's a healthy competition as well. And you can learn from each other and develop it.
Right. That whole sort of, you get this period sort of 65, 66, where you get, Pet Sounds and Revolver and Rubber Soul, and bringing it all back home. And, Blonde on Blonde and Highway 61 Revisited. I think those are the sort of keys,
Yes.
those albums.
Yeah.
Like that's like the foundation almost of everything, you
It all
know.
changes, doesn't it?
Yeah. And I'm talking, like 65, early 66, because later 66 we get, the Who and Cream and the Jimi Hendrix Experience, that takes everything to another level,
Yeah.
completely another level. That's a book unto itself.
Yeah. I mean, this decade of the 60s is so special and unique. And we see it starting in the 50s, because you get the very first teenagers, they got disposable income. So now they're a target market. So then you're getting music targeted at that age group, but you're getting films targeted at that age group. So I know over here, I think one of the very first sort of music ones was with Tommy Steele. So he becomes one of our very first sort of rock and roll stars. So straight away you got like the Tommy Steele story, and you start seeing the pop stars making films in the mid to late 50s. And you're thinking, okay, this is the start of something. And yeah, it'll never happen again. This purple period of mid 50s through the 60s, it's a unique time in history.
You don't really see sort of scenes, quote unquote, anymore. And I think some of this is simply because of not some big bad boogeyman, but because of technology.
Yeah,
I think that the internet, I think, has made things so much more homogenized. And I'm not necessarily saying that in a negative way.
mm,
It's just kind of what happens. Because if you
yeah,
look at all the music in the 60s, the 70s, it's these places, like some of the ones I mentioned, but
yeah,
Chicago, would be another place,
of course.
Nashville, New Orleans, Memphis,
Yeah,
then the different regions in the UK, the Birmingham,
yeah,
Manchester, London, Liverpool, and then this continues on really until, I mean, I guess the last time we had any sort of regional musical explosions in the world was probably rap music with like Compton and various places in New York, and the Seattle grunge music scene, where
yeah,
you have a music that stems from, it grows up from a particular culture, and it
yeah.
creates a certain kind of music. Now we don't really have that. There is
No,
no, fill in the blank scene. And
no,
again, I'm not being necessarily negative or judgmental here.
no.
I think it's just, Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. So the medium is the internet. So the internet is everywhere. So it
Yeah,
does not
exactly.
necessarily create something unique and special to a place. And I think that's a
Yeah.
lot of what's missing from music today. But don't get me started on that subject.
No, but I totally get it, because with the internet, it's the borders are down, and because people can imitate and everything like that. Let's not get onto AI, but you don't then have, as you're saying, this has come out of a city. So the last big one I can sort of remember over here, I suppose, was the 90s, when Manchester was producing all these groups.
Right.
And
Happy
you're getting
Mondays and all of that. Right.
The Smiths,
Right.
Oasis, etc. And there
Right.
was like this revival, but then you then had a rival one going on in London with Blur, and bands like that. So, but
Right.
after that, as you say, you can't really pin anything down to a particular city or region almost anymore.
Right. I mean, we've had like almost nothing. I mean, at least you sort of had, and I know some people, when I say these particular names, are going to be like, "Oh, I don't like that music; it's too commercial." You had Adele, and you had Sam Smith and
Yeah,
people, and Coldplay, and Keane, and those people. And I know a lot of people are like, "Oh, that music is horrible music," but um that was a very British
yeah,
music. It reflected the culture. It
yeah,
really did. It was, I think all those people I mentioned are quality music
yes,
as far as I'm
absolutely.
concerned. You
Yeah,
know,
I
I
agree.
mean, are they past, some of them maybe past their prime? I'm not going to judge. I'm not going to judge that. But from my point of view here, when I heard that music, it was like, oh, really good music coming out of London, coming out of England again. It's here. It's happening again. Now, this is a long time ago. I mean,
Yeah,
obviously, Adele and Sam are more recent than
yeah.
Coldplay, Keane, and those folks. But you know, so anyway, we've really gotten off the subject.
It is, but
But
it's
this is
great because,
fun. I love these kind of conversations.
well, exactly because it's culture, and that's one of those things we always go back to is that how much the Beatles didn't just change music, but change the culture. So we sort of you need to establish that culture, and so the context of what it was like. They burst through the scene where over here there hadn't been groups with guitars. That wasn't a thing. You certainly didn't get many singer songwriters. I mean, that was so rare. So suddenly you got these guys with this new sound, which is heavily American influenced, but with a Liverpool twist on it. And they're doing something which has got elements of, you can hear the country music, you can hear the rock and roll, you can hear all those American influences they put together. And they just break through with something completely different. And the biggest thing, as we were saying, culturally, with a city, even though Liverpool and London are 200 miles apart, they might as well be on different continents. Because for back then, the gap was huge. No record company would think of leaving the comfort of London to go looking for talent. Everything had to come to them.
Yeah,
And the Beatles changed that because suddenly they're going, hang on, maybe there is something happening up north. And they go then searching. So culturally, that was a huge change as well. And it was
yeah,
something different. The Liverpool accent is acceptable. Whereas on the BBC, because you only had a couple of channels, was the Queen's English. Even the
yes,
leading comedians of the decades just before that, majority of those really were from Liverpool, but they couldn't use a Liverpool accent. But the Beatles throwed that out. And I think that tees us up nicely for when they say to Alan Owen, we want a film and we get a Hard Day's Night. So over to you, Steve. Come on. Let's go a Hard Day's
yeah.
Night.
I mean, Alan, I think is he's significant in this story, and I talk about this in the book because he
Yeah.
is from Liverpool, and he hangs out with them, and he does try to translate kind of not just the way they speak, but that life, that the bubble they were living in. I know that later John Lennon didn't really appreciate Alan. I think what did he call him, a professional Liverpool man or something like that?
We have a
You
phrase
know.
called professional scousers,
Okay. All
um,
right.
which can apply to somebody who makes the most of it. But
Okay.
no,
All right.
I, I think Alan Lowe deserves a lot of credit for what he
Yes. I
did.
mean, I think he does. It's interesting. He's sort of his his writing career didn't end after A Hard Day's Night, but his
No,
career as a screenwriter ended. I mean, he just never did film anymore, which is interesting. I don't know
yeah,
why.
no,
You know, I mean, he did other things. He did theater. He did television. I mean, he continued on. His career didn't end.
mm,
But I mean, you know, I think what happens with A Hard Day's Night is all of these kind of happy accidents where the Beatles are suddenly, as they always were from the beginning, they surround themselves with the right people.
yeah,
Some of it is just serendipity.
yeah,
I mean, United Artists was the right film company to make A Hard Day's Night. And I talk about this in great depth in the
yeah,
book. You know, having Richard Lester be the director, an American living in England,
yeah,
the perfect person, extremely intelligent man, a musician. He's also a musician, so he understands music.
yeah,
He's perfect. Um, the whole concept of not making let's put on a show, or the silly story where the
yeah,
group shows up in a couple of scenes, not doing that, making it this sort of kind of cinema verite film, but
yeah,
it's not nonfiction. It just kind of works. It's just
yeah,
perfect, and people are sort of ready for it. And I think, Lester was very influenced by working in television and making commercials for television. Now you would look at that and say, well, that would be a lesser art form. Although, of course, nowadays we have all the very well done streaming sort of, material
like
that's
mini
out there.
films, aren't they? Some of them, though.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But, so this new, fresh way to sort of create visual entertainment, because let's face it, back then films took a long time to make, to raise the money, to hire the producer, director, write the screenplay, cast it, shoot it, edit it, put it out there. It's a long period of time, where television is now. You make it, it's live. There's a freshness to it. At that time there was, particularly in England. So this all is just kind of just works. It's always interesting too. I talk a lot about this, how the Beatles work a lot with people, or there's people in England creating who are Americans in England. I mean, that they would work, or people around them would work later with Tony Visconti, an American in England. Stanley Kubrick making films, really important films at this time. Gilbert Taylor was the cinematographer on A Hard Day's Night. He was also the cinematographer on Dr. Strangelove. Okay, which is, two very different directors, two very different kinds of films. They're both black and white, though. But so interesting. Obviously Walter Shenson, he's an American. Various people at United Artists who were involved with bringing the Beatles into the tent are Americans. So it's interesting how this is all kind of fermenting. The James Bond films, that one of the producers, I always forget which one, he was a Canadian. He wasn't British. So you have all of this kind of happening. I think there was a lot of Americans who felt that going to England, it was a little bit more, the production was, there was a little bit more put into production. There was a little bit more willing to be make things that were a little smarter, make things that were a little more interesting, a little bit more out there.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And of course, so A Hard Day's Night then becomes the benchmark for every film that mentions and features any musical artists. I mean, that's the one that everybody now says you have to compare it to this film, which it looks like it's thrown together, but it looks so natural at the same time. But you've got the fun, you've got the the little stories happening around it. It's great use of just developing the characters for each of the four Beatles. But then, and again, having this conversation with somebody yesterday, how many times when you're saying, what's your favorite Beatles album? How many people go for the soundtrack for A Hard Day's Night?
Yeah.
And if you haven't listened to it for a while, go listen to it, because the soundtrack is phenomenal. It really is. And it's, like you say, it's a part of the film, but it doesn't look corny like earlier films had done.
Right. I think it was Dennis O'Dell who said, the thing with A Hard Day's Night, it was this teen pop music movie, but the people behind the scenes were some of the best people making films in England. These were the A-list folks. And, so they bring a certain something to it, I mean, look, obviously some of this is just kind of timing, it's serendipity. It's just, as was the case quite a bit with the Beatles, particularly in the beginning, I mean, some of it is talent, some of it is hard work, but some of it is right place, right time, and absorbing influences and then putting it back out there. One of the things I really tried to do with this book is I wanted to make sure that not the Beatles, but the people behind the scenes making these movies receive their due. Not to take anything away from the four lads, but to make people realize these are great filmmakers.
Yes.
Director, cinematographer, screenwriter, wardrobe, whatever it was. And these were people that were making great films before A Hard Day's Night, after A Hard Day's Night, and in some cases went on for decades making movies. I've said this before. You have a lot of folks who worked with the Beatles on their films in the 60s who would go on to work on the Lord of the Rings films with Peter Jackson, would work on, Star Wars films, would work on the Harry Potter films,
So
So
these biggest films that there have been.
right. So, these are, I mean, some of them were very young when they started, working on these films. It was
Yeah.
fun tracing the filmographies of
Yeah.
people that worked on the films. And I go into this in great depth because I wanted them to, I felt it was significant that they received their due. And I spoke with people, who worked on some of these films. I mean, obviously later on with Let It Be, I spoke with Michael Lindsay-Hogg. I spoke with him.
Yeah.
And I spoke with him when I did my previous book on the Beatles, when I did the Let It Be book. But it was, the people that go back. And I would have loved to have spoken with more of them. But at this point, unfortunately, some of them are no longer with us.
Of course.
Some of them just don't really do interviews anymore. you know. Um, I mean, I would have loved to have talked to Richard Lester, but I don't think he's done interviews for quite a while.
No.
It's been
No.
quite a long time. It would have been great to have spoken with him. I wish I had written this book 10 or 20 years ago. Maybe it would have been easy to get Richard, but, I talked to as many people as I could. And, I try to create some context too by talking to other people, other film directors. I talked to Cameron Crowe, which was great because, I mean, there's nobody today who makes movies with a pop music backdrop better than Cameron. I mean, other than maybe Marty Scorsese, which he would have been great to talk to, but he's so busy. He's always doing something. I didn't even try. But, I talked to Ralph Bakshi, who did the first Lord of the Rings film that was animated. And, it was interesting to kind of get his take on things. And he worked with the Rolling Stones. So, it was interesting to get these people to sort of provide some context. I talked to the person who was the director of the film about Frida Kelly, so that was interesting to get that sort of point of view. It's, you go into these things and obviously you have certain knowledge or certain preconceived notions about things. But I like to do the research and talk to different people. And then you get the real story, the real picture. Exactly. And I try not to editorialize too much. I'd rather just kind of do the research and put the information out there and let the readers decide what they think of things,
Exactly the way I do things. We think and act exactly the same way. Give everybody the credit they deserve and let their words speak. Because that's what I've always wanted from a book, is if somebody's been interviewed, I don't want lots of opinion from the author. I want the words of the person being interviewed. So we think alike, and it's, for me, that's what I love about your book. That's what I wanted from this, was to hear that those people and get their voice.
Right. And not just the people that worked on the Beatles films or worked with the Beatles, get some other kind of points of view where you kind of step outside of it and, how it influenced them. Cameron, he gave me what he thought of each of the 5 films. And I talk about that, in the book. I thought that was important because I think it adds some sort of retrospective analysis to things. I mean, I will sort of make points, or I hate to use the word put my opinion in because we don't want to put everybody to sleep. But, it's like, I really, look, let's face it, Help and particularly Magical Mystery Tour, people have some very strong negative opinions about those films, particularly Magical Mystery Tour. Even Let It Be, let's face it, there's some strong negative opinions. I don't share those opinions. And I think part of what I wanted to do too is talk about those films and give a sort of broader understanding of them as films and where they fit in the sort of the Beatles careers, but where they fit in film history, and what can be gleaned from them. I mean, I think looking back now, when you rewatch Help and you rewatch Magical Mystery Tour, they age very well, and I think you get more out of them now. I don't think there's any question about it. Particularly Magical Mystery Tour, because Magical Mystery Tour, when it was first shown, as you and everybody who's watching this knows, it was shown on television in black and white. So now you can watch it at home on Blu-ray on your 50-inch television, which is what I have, like a, 46-inch brand new color TV, 4K, with my amp and my 5.1 sound system with my subwoofer. So it's like, so you really can well, I've put it together slowly over the years, but I mean, it's still, you really can experience it. When people watched it on TV on Boxing Day in England in 1967 on their television, which was, the screen was the size of a laptop screen.
Exactly, the little screens like this, aren't you?
Exactly. So now it's you can experience it much differently now.
No, it's a very good point. It's almost like it was made in 67, but it was like it was made for the 21st century to be fully enjoyed. And maybe that from that concept and what they're trying to do was so ahead of its time that unless you were watching it on a cinema screen at the pictures, it's not made for TV for the time then. You can't fully enjoy what's going on.
Right. If it was shown in cinemas to the kind of audiences in places like London or New York or LA or San Francisco or Boston or wherever, Paris, you name it, Rome, who walk into the theater with a certain understanding of that psychedelic culture that was happening. I think there was so much, we forget this, or there's people that just don't know it, that there was so much that was going on, say in 67, that was only going on in these very sort of rarefied cosmopolitan cities.
Definitely.
In the 70s, I think what would happen is the culture would reach out to larger audiences and more people, to teenagers in the suburbs in the 70s. They were plugged into what was going on. But in 1967, it still was very confined to these enclaves of culture, of enlightened, switched on, turned on, whatever you want to call it, people, and we're not condoning that either. You know what I'm saying? To show it to every, person in England the day after Christmas, when they're nursing their hangovers and they're sitting around with grandma and the kids
falling asleep,
it was again, the medium is the message. It was the wrong medium and the wrong message.
Absolutely right. Yeah, and that's what's done the most damage. So then it gets the bad reputation back then, which sort of stays with it. And so most people, quite often, if you have a conversation about Beatles films, they'll tell you Hard Day's Night, Help, and Yellow Submarine. That's all they would consider as Beatles films. So everything else is ignored. Right.
And some people might even suggest that Yellow Submarine, it's almost not a Beatles film because they're not really in it, other than that little thing at the end. It's not their voices. They only contribute 4 brand new songs to that particular film. I talked a lot about who made Yellow Submarine in my book. I get really into, I talked to a number of the people behind the scenes. I think that, as and a lot of people watching this know, Dr. Bob Hieronymus has written 2 books on Yellow Submarine. I mean, those are the definitive books on the making of that film. And he really gives that film its due. And he was so much involved with the sort of revival of it, and bringing it back and celebrating it. It is an important film. It's the
Yeah.
first really feature-length animated film made specifically for adults. While there were films in the past that maybe adults could also go and enjoy, those animated films were made for children. They weren't made
Yeah.
for adults.
Yeah.
So
It's a very good point.
this is an important film. Now, how much the Beatles, the four guys, have to do with that, in some cases, is minimal in
Yeah.
terms of the day-to-day making of the film. And so I really wanted to bring that out. And Dr. Bob does this. I mean, those two books, they're definitive. No one is
Yeah.
going to ever write about Yellow Submarine in a more definitive way. I don't think.
I agree. Yeah. So and again, so that's giving the credit, but it's the context again. It's like you're just saying there of being, so the first animated film made for adults. That's a big, big thing in the film world. That's a significant event with a film. So again, it's just giving it the context. And again, and most people, like we were just saying, so Hard Day's Night, Help, Yellow Submarine, Magical Mystery Tour, whoever includes Let It Be as a Beatles film.
Yeah. And I mean, when Yellow Submarine was released, United Artists didn't know what to do with it. And it had a very short run. And the Beatles were not happy with that. They felt that United Artists didn't distribute the film enough, and they didn't let the film stay out in theaters long enough. It was kind of like, what do we do with this thing? It's not for children, really. And are adults going to go watch an animated film? That was one of the things when I did my research that really surprised me, was just how little they cared about this film, that they just did not know what to do with it. And, initially the idea was this would be the film that would fulfill the contract of the third film that the Beatles owed United Artists. And United Artists said, no, we don't view this film that way. They did distribute the film, but it did not fulfill the contract. So it's interesting. All of these films, you could say that Help has a certain, it complements A Hard Day's Night, or it has certain similarities to A Hard Day's Night. It's a fiction film. It's the Beatles in this kind of madcap thing. Other than that, it is in color, and it is different. But the other films are all completely different. You have an animated film, you have a documentary, and nobody knows what Magical Mystery Tour is. What is it? No one knows what. But that's good. That was cool. Great soundtrack. I mean, especially the Capitol Records soundtrack. That was the best thing Capitol ever did for the Beatles, was to make that full-length soundtrack album and take what Parlophone had put out as a double EP. Yeah. And eventually, EMI said, that's Magical Mystery Tour, the Capitol version, in terms of the sequencing and the packaging. So
Capitol for once actually got it right over Parlophone, because nearly always it was the other way around.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. No, they're great. So which brings us on to Let It Be. And of course, the timing's great because it's just been re-released. So I watched that when it appeared on screens last week. And it's nice that at the beginning got that little conversation between Peter Jackson and Michael Lindsay-Hogg. And this maybe one you can answer for me then, because obviously we've had the Get Back series. Michael Lindsay-Hogg has made the film, and we've got the edit of Let It Be. Peter Jackson's then coming. Would you still consider then Michael Lindsay-Hogg to be director? So what would you consider Peter Jackson's role? Is he like re-editing it, or is it a bit of directorial credit as well? How do you see the difference between those two?
Well, one of the things is I had to do something different with this recent book when I talked about Let It Be, because of this book that I did. This is from the 33 1/3 series. This came out 20 years ago. Okay. And yes, I know, right? And this is mostly about the album. And, this book is still in print. It's been translated into, see if I can get this right, Greek, Italian, Japanese, and Chinese. I think that's it.
Wow.
Okay. Yes. Yes. So again, though, that book was more about the album than the film, but I talked to a lot of the filmmakers, including Michael.
Mm.
So when I watched Get Back, what it was basically, it's hard to do this, but I'll try to do it quickly, is he took all of this film. I mean, they were shooting, when I interviewed people for the Let It Be book, they told me, the audio and video people, they said, as soon as one of the Beatles showed up that day, start filming, start audio recording. When the last Beatle leaves for the day, you turn everything off.
Yeah.
So over almost a month between Apple and Twickenham,
Yeah.
you have, and you know all this, you have hours and hours and hours and hours of film that was boiled down to a 80, 90-minute feature-length film that we saw in 1970. And it was done a certain way, it looked a certain way, and here's what I think is the most important thing. It was, people saw it, and they saw it and viewed it through the prism of, these guys have broken up.
Exactly.
And the 60s are over. Okay. So they're, again, context, they're bringing all of that to bear. Okay. Fast forward to Get Back, this film, Let It Be, we haven't seen it in forever. It was only ever put out on VHS and Laserdisc, which Laserdisc lasted for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
I mean, it had been shown on television. It was probably shown in theaters, but it has basically been absent. So now we get this thing, Get Back, which originally was not supposed to be as long as it was, but because of COVID and because Peter just kept going, it became this thing that became bigger and bigger and bigger. And again, Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. COVID has locked everybody in at home. This can't be shown in movie theaters.
Yeah.
They finally decide, well, you know what we'll do? Disney, we own this thing. We're going to show this on our streaming channel. Streaming, COVID is what really kicked streaming into the mainstream. Streaming has been here for a while. Streaming had been successful, but suddenly we're all stuck at home. All of these film studios have movies that are completed. They can't show them in the movie theaters. Okay, we'll show them on our streaming channel, or we'll start a streaming channel.
Yeah.
And that's what we'll do. So now, you have this thing, and Peter Jackson, God bless him, cleans it up, cleans up the audio, gives us a much more well-rounded narrative of what was really going on every day. When I did the Let It Be book, and I've said this about 100 times, I talked to people who said Let It Be was not gloom and doom all the time, that there was a lot of fun stuff. Particularly, John Lennon was just a complete comedian, during a lot of the making of it. And so I know there were some people that felt that, oh, Peter is, this is revisionism, and that, Paul wants to change the narrative. No, it's not true. There was good days and there were bad days. And I think if you watch Get Back, there seems more of a fuller picture of good and bad than if you watch this new version of Let It Be. This new version of Let It Be, to me, it feels like it moves really quickly. It really goes faster. And it looks better. It looks cleaner. You don't now, if you didn't know anything about the Beatles' history, you wouldn't think, oh, these guys don't like each other and they just broke up, and, George and Paul are at each other's throats. You wouldn't think that if you come to this fresh, I'm glad that both exist. And I'm particularly glad that Michael is receiving the due that he deserves, because he is a great filmmaker. I mean, he has done so much. I mean, he did Brideshead Revisited. He was the key guy who made Ready, Steady, Go probably the best pop music television show to ever exist. I mean, he directed so many episodes, you know. I mean, he's a great guy. He's a Renaissance man too. He's an artist. He's royalty. He's the
Yeah,
nicest guy. I don't know if you've ever met him and talked to him at any length, but I have, and
yeah.
he's the sweetest guy. So
And I
it's
think
so
that
good.
I think that's one of the lovely things with the Get Back series, that we actually get to know Michael quite a lot through that, and how heavily involved he was. He wasn't just stuck behind the camera directing things. He's in the conversation with them, trying to get their ideas, trying to see what they wanted, and coming up with new ideas. And let's try this, let's try that. And I think that was one of the great things. And I think, to be fair to Peter Jackson as well, he's not trying to take credit away from Michael for what he'd
No,
done. And I think he's realized that here was a guy who had this vision with these musicians who weren't always completely cooperative, in an awkward situation, stuck in a big film studio. Then they move to Apple, and he can still, okay, we'll change that. Then we're going to be in an amphitheater on a cruise ship. No, we're going to be on a roof. And I think one of the things I noticed then with watching Get Back and watching Let It Be again, what he'd managed to capture is what's on the roof in full glorious Technicolor is the future. And then he's captured, it's almost like on the street, everything's still grey, of these older people who look as if they're from, a decade earlier. The difference, and I think that's what Michael captured so well, was what they were doing up here was the future. Even if the Beatles were splitting, they were so far advanced. And everybody down on the street level was so far behind what was going on. And that's not the kind of thing you can go back and re-edit into a story to make it happen. He had the vision to do that. And I think,
yeah,
I'm so glad exactly we agree on that, because I think Michael did a fantastic job. He really did. And then Peter's just worked with it. But one question for you, which is the one that came up with Get Back, is this whole idea of having the microphone like in the cafeteria. So was that there all the time? Do you know? Because I've been so curious that it picks up this conversation between John and Paul, and thinking, who would have thought of doing that, of picking up this conversation? Do you know much about
I
that?
don't know the exact date when it was done, but I mean, you're making a great point, and what you're illustrating is just how smart Michael is. Like he realized that, my guess is what happened is they're looking at the rushes, they're listening also, and they're saying, hey, you know what? There's something was going on over there, and we didn't pick it up because we
Yes.
had a microphone over here. So, okay, how do we fix that? And so they probably just started thinking, okay, we need to put mics here. We need to put mics there. We need to put cameras over there, and, Michael's a smart guy. He's just, he's an innovator.
Yeah,
He's an
absolutely.
innovator. It's so great too, because with Peter and Michael, it's like this mutual admiration
Oh,
society. And
completely.
what's great about it, and look, I've met Michael, I've interviewed him. I don't know him that well. I've never met or interviewed Peter, although I would love to. Here
Yeah.
I am, Peter. Let me know. I'm really interested. I'm a big fan. Um, you know, they're both incredibly talented, but I think they're both good people. And I
Yeah.
think that neither one of them exploited their opportunity with the Beatles.
Yes.
I think that they were professional and tried to tell a story, but I think that they were respectful. I think some other filmmakers might have crossed the line. I also think that neither Michael or Peter have made themselves out to be more important in this story than they are, although they're both extremely important in
Absolutely.
the history of the Beatles.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that Peter now is working on another film. He's moved on.
Yeah.
I don't know if it is a Lord of the Rings or Hobbit film. I forget what it is, but he is still part of the story. He bought the Star Club tapes, I guess, as you know. So I don't know what the legal implications are of that. And we don't need to get into a talk about that. But I think that he is still, look, his Mal audio software or whatever it is part of now what Giles Martin is using to put out these reissues. I mean, obviously the first one that he really got involved with this in a big way was Revolver, and we're all waiting on Rubber Soul, but we're not going to have a conversation about that. So, what's interesting about Michael too, just to put a lid on Let It Be, unless we're going to talk more about it, is his Hey Jude video, and this is what sparks the Beatles making Let It Be.
Yeah.
Because they enjoyed that experience so much.
Yeah.
And that's what, Dennis Dell, when I interviewed Dennis for the Let It Be book, I mean, that was the main point that he made to me, that they did the Hey Jude video, and that's what got them back into considering performing live.
Yeah.
And that's what gives us the Let It Be film.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the right, as it has been all the way through, it's the right people being in that right place at the right time, and at the right time for the Beatles as well. And it's so key of getting, like you say, starting with Richard Lester and moving the way through. It's having getting those right, and sometimes they, like you were saying, you need to be a little bit left field of saying we don't want conventional, because the Beatles didn't want conventional. You had to have somebody with that kind of innovative, creative mind who could spend time with them, see where they were at. And I think that's what, funnily enough, that Peter brings out for us to see and know more about Michael in the Get Back series, of him having those conversations and getting to understand them and realizing what they wanted, and then being able to adapt, not being sort of like, I'm the director, you're going to sit there, you're going to do that, this is the way we're going to do it. And I think that's a big thing for him. It was never about his ego imposing on them. And maybe that's why they got on so well with him and let him do that. Because he thought, he's just like one of us. He's a creative guy. He's thinking, he's making things up on the spot. He's adapting. We can work with him.
I think, part of what it always was with the Beatles, and I even think after, when they went on to their solo careers, is they obviously want to work with talented people, but it's also, it has to be there has to be some kind of connection. They have to feel this certain level of comfort, and not the where the Beatles don't tell us what to do. I don't think the Beatles were like that. They worked with they worked with a lot of heavyweight people, that were gonna tell them, hey, that doesn't work, or that works. I think part of what it was too is, and I know this becomes like, oh, the 60s was great, and everything else after is not, but there were no rules back then. All this stuff was new. There was no playbook, so you just kind of did things. And so you had people being very creative and trying new things and being innovative. And, now everything it's so expensive to make a film. And now everything is focus grouped. And all these film companies are owned by these large corporations.
Yeah.
And there's so much fear. And, we've got to make a movie that everybody in the world is going to like. That's
it's
why
got to be safe.
Right. And that's why these superhero movies are so big, because they're action films. They're easy to sell around the world. It's not so much about dialogue, so it's and you can do, they're tentpole movies. You put them out in the summer and you can keep making sequels, and it's about money. It's about creating product. And the Beatles were not creating product. They were making art. They were making popular art, but they were making, they kept raising the bar.
As they did musically.
They just kept doing.
Yeah. They were never, happy to settle. And, no other band could do what they did, which was every album was a progression. And there was experimentation going on there as well. They were never afraid to take a risk, to take a chance, to express themselves and not think, well, Please Please Me went to #1 as an album. That's great. We'll just keep doing the same thing. They never settled for it. So that's how you get, these 5 films, none of which are identical. And again, that's what you're pulling out by giving us more of the context for each one. And I think that then helps us go back and look at them differently and say, look, this is what was happening at the time. They'd already done this one. And maybe some people thought, I loved A Hard Day's Night. Why couldn't we just have 2 or 3 other Hard Day's Night films?
Right.
But that just wouldn't work. You have got to do something different. And each one is different. And maybe because you've isolated it and concentrate particularly on those 5 films like that, that helps us to see them standalone, but in the context of when they were done as well. And that must have been so much fun for you to do.
Yeah, I mean, that's, the research is, you go into this and, I've written other books. I've written about the Beatles previously. I'm a journalist. You go into it, and as a fan, you have a certain amount of knowledge and understanding. But as soon as you start researching, you start realizing how little you really know.
Yeah.
It's incredible. I mean, there are some people that like yourself and Mark Lewison and Bruce Spicer and Ken Womack and, folks like that who are just such experts. I mean, I'm not in that realm. I'm not in that company. I work hard and I do my research, but it's like you learn so much. That's what's so great about doing these books is it's this great learning experience. There's so much I didn't know.
Yeah.
And so, you come away with that. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is because I'm a little older now, and I started this book. I mean, it's 5 years ago, really, that I started the book. So there's things I forget. People will ask questions sometimes.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't remember. Look, the book is packed with information.
Absolutely.
And it's factual. It's stuff that's just out there. It's not my creative genius. It's just information. And you can't remember it all. I get interviewed by certain people, and it's like, I've had some great interviews with Ken Michaels, another person who knows so much.
He's great,
unbelievable. Ken. I mean, he's interviewed everybody.
Yeah.
And he'll ask questions, and he always catches me where I don't know. I'm just being honest, rather than sound like the smart guy. And he's asking the question not to play gotcha. He's asking it because he doesn't know, or he forgot, or he wants to just bring some context to things.
Yeah.
And I like to be challenged like that, because then it makes me say, I've got to go back. Somebody just asked me a question on Twitter. It's funny, and I was like, I don't know. I can't. Some of the questions are so minute. Like somebody just asked me, a DJ who I know, who's on the Beatles channel. He asked me, it's Dennis Elsis, the legendary New York DJ. He asked me a question that somebody asked him a question, and he asked me if I could answer it. And I'm like, no, I can't. And it was almost a question where I felt like it's one of those things that I think sometimes we read too much into this stuff, And I gave him this sort of jokey metaphor of, I think it's Stardust Memories, the Woody Allen movie, where people are watching a screening and then they get up and they're walking out and they're talking about the film. And somebody says, so what do you think the significance of Woody Allen's or the director's Rolls Royce is in the movie? And one of the people say, I think it signifies his car. It doesn't, that's all it is. It's the car he drove. It doesn't signify anything beyond that, I think we like to read more into these things, although sometimes things are uncovered that do shed further light onto the art and the way the art was made. There's no question
Yes.
about it.
Yeah.
So it's difficult.
Well, it's like for the bit of fun is the Paul is dead thing. Once you start on that, everybody then goes looking for the clues to prove something which is obviously complete nonsense. But oh no, the evidence is there. And it's like with anything, if you're determined to go and find something, you will find evidence somewhere, even if it's completely irrelevant. You go looking for it, and no, you're completely right. It's yeah, we want to read so much into it. Oh no, actually, we know what he was thinking. No, we don't, because he didn't know what he was thinking. No, let's not get
Right.
too carried away. But no, and I know what you mean about the questions. I get asked. No, so remember on page 233 of Liverpool when you said this, that book came out in 2009, and I've done several of the books since, and I'm supposed to carry all of that in my head. And as you say, we're not getting any younger.
I'm not. You might be. I'm not.
Oh, I've got birthday coming up, so trust me, I'm not.
Okay.
But it's the fun, and it's that buzz when you're a researcher and you do find something different, you do find something new. You cannot explain that to somebody else, but the excitement, and you're bursting then to tell somebody else, I've just found this. And it may not be the biggest or most important thing ever, but you think, wow, I've just discovered this. And it makes it worthwhile then. And then that's what keeps us going. As you say, you're starting a project, think, I know most of this. This is going to be straightforward. No, it isn't. Wow, I never knew that. Well, hang on. Then you start talking to everybody. I think, I never thought of that. The thing just from our conversation now, of the context you've been putting, it's made me think differently about the films.
Okay.
And that's the great thing of doing stuff like this and having these conversations.
Yeah.
Because we can all help each other understand all of that so much better.
Yeah. I mean, when I started this book, I intended it to be about a 200-page book. That's what I thought it was going to be. And it's somewhere between 300 and 350 pages with the index and bibliography and everything. The manuscript was over 500 pages. So this book was scaled down from what I delivered to the publisher, So you want to put you're so afraid that if you don't put something in, somebody's going to say, well, why didn't you put that in? How could you not do that? Yeah. And that question is a justified question. You want to say everything. There's a few people have suggested that maybe there's too much information in this book. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I wanted to make sure that it was accurate. And I had a lot of Beatle people read the book before it was published, to make sure that I was correct, because you make mistakes, and you repeat mistakes that are repeated in book after book after book, so it was really important to me. But I also wanted to write a book that anybody could read and enjoy. And that's a challenge. That's definitely a challenge. You could write a Beatle fanboy book, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that book, but I wanted to write a book that you, David Bedford, could read, but somebody who's in a bookstore and says, oh, I like the Beatles. Oh, here's a book on their films. I'd like to read it. So I put in the book certain baseline things, not assuming that everybody knows all of this stuff.
Exactly.
I gave a real history of EMI Studios. I thought that was important to do that. There was I gave a certain history of the British invasion. I felt those things were important. Super fans are going to know a lot of that stuff. But I felt that, again, to add context, I wanted the book to be inclusive. I didn't want it to just be a throwaway book, but I didn't want it to be just for Beatle scholars. I wanted to create an inclusive book.
Yeah.
I want to have everybody in the tent. Everybody's welcome. Yeah. A splendid time is guaranteed for all.
Oh, write that one down. That could work as well.
It could work.
Well, I think you've done a brilliant job with it.
Thank you.
And what's up next for you?
Well, in terms of whatever future books I may or may not write, when I'm at this point in a project, I'm still publicizing. The book is still very much out there. I'm doing things like this, and
Great,
I have an event coming up. I'm coming back to London again this summer, like I did last
great.
summer. I was in London, and I'm going to have an event at the British Film Institute in London, in the South Bank, at the I think it's the Rubin Library. It's called. It will be on August 19th, and it will be mostly to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the release of the film A Hard Day's Night. Although that actually is in, I think, later mid July, mid late July. But so I will be there, and I believe it's a free event. Anybody can come down, and it's an amazing facility there. I went there last summer and saw it. I mean, it's a film
Right.
haven. If you love film, it is one of the greatest film centers in the world, as far as I'm concerned. And so I'm going to give a talk, and I'm going to answer questions, and there'll be copies of both of my books there.
Right.
And it should be fun. It's going to be great to come back to London. Thoroughly enjoy being in London.
Yeah.
It's just an incredible city. So I'm looking forward to that. That's the big sort of thing that's coming up. I'll have other things in the short term, probably going on closer to home here in New York.
Sure.
But so I'm really looking forward to that. So please come. I'd love to meet you, and any of the British people, come and visit. Paul, if you're in town, Ringo, if you're in town, I would love for you to come by.
Brilliant.
I actually met Paul once.
Oh,
cool. I was at a press conference for the Flowers of the Dirt tour. It was a round table of about 12 or 15 journalists, and we all got to ask him questions for a few hours. And a couple of us stayed there after everybody kind of left, and Paul hung around, and he chatted, and it was cool. Great. When it happened, it was like, oh yeah, that's cool. And now I'm like, I can't believe that actually happened. That's the only time I ever met any of the Beatles.
Yeah. Oh,
so
well
it was, I'm a fan, and, it was just great to have met him, and he was really cool, and he was really friendly. Yeah. And it was great, so I don't know if you've met any of the see, they really should meet you, because I don't think there's anybody that's done more to put Liverpool on the map in a book than you. So
that's my passion.
So, they should know you, and they probably do. I'm sure
they probably
Paul
know
does.
of me. That's probably why they haven't met me. Maybe.
I doubt it.
Okay, so big finale, Steve. Come on, tell us where we can buy the book. Hold up the book again, and then tell us where we can buy it.
Okay. Well, as John Lennon once said, it's the usual rubbish, but it doesn't cost much. So here it is: Act Naturally, The Beatles on Film by Steve Matteo. My name is not in the little square there like yours is. It just says S, and that's like M in the Bond films.
In the Bond films.
So instead of M, I'm S. And you can get, it's on Amazon. I think it's reduced to a really good price right now on Amazon. And Barnes and Noble stores and Barnes and Noble's website. Please go to your independent bookstores and pick it up. I know it's in a lot of bookstores in London.
Yeah.
You can easily find it there, or they'll order it for you. And this book is still out there. This book is very available too, part of the 33 1/3 series.
Yeah.
Great series of books on individual albums. It's great that it's still in print. And I'm on various social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever the kids are into these days, whatever the new platforms are. I'll occasionally send up smoke signals from where I live out in suburban New York.
Bit of semaphore as well.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So
brilliant.
We're here.
Thanks,
we're out there, and thank you. It's so great to do this with you. I'm a big fan.
Really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed it. And yeah, go buy the book. It's brilliant. Well done for all your hard work on it. Best of luck, and I will
Thank you.
see you at the next event, my friend.
Yes. Cheers and thank you.
Take care. See
All
you
right.
soon.
Bye-bye.
See you.